Random House Audio presents The Man Who Owns the News, Inside the Secret World of Rupert Murdoch, by Michael Wolff, read by the author.
Fall 2007 through winter 2008. Rupert Murdoch, a man without discernible hubris, or at least conventional grandiosity, had nevertheless begun to believe that his takeover of Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal, something he dreamt about for most of his career, might actually indicate that he and his company, News Corporation, had a certain destiny, a higher purpose of which the world should be made aware. He'd started to think that his triumph in the quest for Dow Jones was an opportunity to rebrand, the kind of marketing frippery he usually disdained. He was even toying with the idea of changing the name of News Corp, that oddly boring, generic-sounding throwback to the company's earliest days. His first paper in Adelaide, Australia, was The News, to something that could better indicate his and News Corp's philosophical reason for being. What that reason for being exactly was, that was still hard to actually put into words, but it had something to do with, look at these. He had mock-ups of full-page ads that, he was thinking, should run in all the Wall Street Journal's competitors, particularly the New York Times and the Financial Times, on the day he took over the paper. One of the ads had the big headline, Agent Provocateur. Another pursued the idea of pirates, the notion being that for more than 50 years the company had been, if not exactly outlaws, not literally, still. When after many hours of conversation with Murdoch, I despaired of ever getting an introspective word out of him, his son-in-law, Matthew Freud, the PR man from London, advised me to ask him about being a change agent. This conversational gambit prompted Murdoch's enthusiastic unfurling of these ads and eager, if far from concrete, ideas. We're change agents, he kept repeating, as though new to the notion, about the meaning of News Corp and, by extension, himself. It also prompted dubious looks from some of the executives closest to him. Murdoch's sudden search for an ennobling and guiding idea was a vexation not just because it called attention to exactly what News Corp executives often despaired of, that image of run-amok ruthlessness that the battle for Dow Jones had stirred up all over again, but also because it was distinctly out of character. Soul-searching wasn't, to say the least, a part of the News Corp culture. So it was curious and unsettling to have the veritable soul of the company trying to figure out why he'd gotten where he'd gotten and for what good reason. Such a statement about his fundamental righteousness, and even perhaps relative coolness, was significantly being urged on him by his son James, a Harvard dropout who had started a music label and then spearheaded News Corp's new media initiatives in the 1990s, and who had become the CEO of British Sky Broadcasting, BSkyB, the News Corp-controlled company that operates the Sky satellite TV network in the United Kingdom. Not long before, Murdoch had favored his older son, Lachlan, and before that his daughter, Elizabeth, to eventually run News Corp. But now it was James. In fact, unbeknownst to the rest of News Corp, James was about to be given responsibility for the UK, Europe, and Asia by his father, who wanted to spend more of his time at the Wall Street Journal and, in addition, wanted to use the opportunity to put James in reach of the top spot in the company, without having to actually turn over the top spot. James had been, much more so than his father, particularly aggravated by the terrible press heaped on his dad and on the company because of the Dow Jones bid. Alternately aggressive and defensive, James was looking for a way to fight back. In fact, It was not entirely clear that the father's sudden enthusiasm for brand development wasn't about pleasing his son, clearly the apple of his eye at the moment. He was very excited about showing off B-Sky-B's annual report, for which his son was responsible, in which he thought was the kind of thing they could be doing at News Corp. Every employee, he said, as though new to the novelty of an expensively produced annual report, could get one. There was enough triumphalism around News Corp to please everybody. Murdoch was, frankly, impressed with himself. Delighted, giddy. He couldn't believe how exhausted he felt once the deal was done. He'd held his anticipation and excitement all inside, and as soon as he could relax, he felt wiped out. Perhaps more than any other accomplishment, getting the Wall Street Journal was, in and of itself, the big one, and not just a next step towards something else. And there was the other stuff, legacy stuff. There were his 2 young children, Grace 6 and her sister Chloe 4, and how they would think of him in, well, the future. And there were his older children, and the importance of defining the meaning of the company he would be leaving them. That was James's point. That was also what he was hearing from Matthew Freud, the Svengali-ish marketer who was now married to the family. Brand was legacy. The bigger the brand message, the bigger the legacy. Plus there was Murdoch's wife Wendy, 39. Her energy, her sense of possibilities, her urge to take over the world, to leave her mark, might be as great as his own. Perhaps they were competing. Not to mention that at nearly 77, even a man without hubris should get a chance to make a statement. If not now, when? On the other hand, it also seemed a potentially great mistake to attribute too much sentiment or craving for positive recognition to his motivations. For one thing, the branding statements toward which Murdoch seemed to gravitate were not so much about News Corp's greatness or vision as they were about kicking dirt in people's faces. His true message about his acquisition of the Wall Street Journal was that he was the winner. A month or so after the Bancroft family voted to sell him their great-great-grandfather's company, Murdoch invited the Journal's 15 top editors to lunch at the Ritz-Carlton downtown, and brought along as the featured guests Carl Allen, the profane, hard-drinking, and foul-tempered editor of the New York Post. In journalistic terms, Allen might be as different from a Wall Street Journal editor as, say, a pit bull from a spaniel. Allen's very presence at the lunch announced that the Wall Street Journal had been taken over by News Corp. Not to mention that it was just delightfully evil of old Rupe to bring old Carl along to scare the bejesus out of his new charges. Murdoch's march into the Wall Street Journal newsroom with his 2 lieutenants, loyal Les Hinton, who ran News Corp's UK operation and who would be coming to run the Dow Jones business, and inscrutable Robert Thompson, the London Times editor who would be taking over the Journal's newsroom, was not the arrival of someone who wanted his great purpose and historic destiny to be roundly applauded. Rather, with the back of his hand, he let it be known that the Wall Street Journal was his most recently conquered nation. The staff at the Journal, many of whom were soon to be displaced persons, were merely history's flotsam and jetsam. They were the impediments to change. He was the change agent. We might, he said one afternoon as he considered his new conquests, have to let people go just to make the point. He summarily replaced Dow Jones top executive Richard Zannino and the Journal's publisher L. Gordon Krovitz. He was purposely brutal with the sitting editor, Marcus Broccoli, who was, in theory, protected by the editorial agreement Murdoch had entered into with the Bancroft family in order to buy the paper. Doing an easy end run around the agreement that precluded him from unilaterally firing the existing editor, Murdoch had brought in his own editor of choice, Thompson, an Australian.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?